Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Casey Schulberg, the Collier County Waterkeeper, and I've been serving as your host for these nightly programs for the last 13 days, along with my co-host, Dr. John Capece, the Kissimmee Waterkeeper. Well, as you see, we're doing things a little differently for this, our last day of COP. We decided to host a casual roundtable with some of the members of our team and do a post-mortem of the conference. Post-mortem, for those of you who've been following these last 2 weeks, may actually be the right term. We're going to start with a three-way conversation between the host of our student streams, Rock Aboujouade, along with our own Esteban Rodofili, who leaves for the airport to fly home in just a few minutes. Then, Wi-Fi permitting, we'll enlarge the group discussion to include Dr. John Capece, Valholly Frank, Douada Gueye, and Jeff Dismukes. So, guys, tell me what you guys covered a lot of ground this week, and I know you put out student streams since day one. What are your impressions of the COP? Do you think it was a worthwhile exercise? Do you think that all this money we spent getting there and moving around, burning a lot of fossil fuel was worthwhile?
I've attended COP since 2015 in Paris. I've seen, everything from Marrakesh, Bonn, Katowice, even in Glasgow, and now I've seen this one taking place in Sharm El Sheikh. And I can say definitively, we are not headed in the right direction, at least from a young person's standpoint. If we're talking about defense of the future, if we're talking about ensuring that the finances are headed the right way, they are not getting done whatsoever. There obviously is some utility in the COPs, especially between scientists meeting other scientists, journalists meeting scientists, delegates meeting scientists. I believe that these events do an excellent job highlighting how the technology is being developed, such that when world governments are ready to commit the financing necessary to fight climate change, we know what technologies are ready and at what pace we can roll them out. Yeah. So as of right now, there clearly isn't enough pressure on world governments to make them adopt this technology, but these events do showcase and highlight a wonderful set of technologies that we know are ready to be implemented once the delegations and the politicians have finally agreed that it's time to finance this.
Yeah, I mean, that's my impression. It's basically a glorified trade show. It's not a conference where international agreements are signed. Esteban, what are your thoughts?
So regarding if it's worth it, it's my first COP. From a personal standpoint, it is worth it. I've learned much. What I've learned doesn't bring me any hope. It's not encouraging the current situation. My analysis goes pretty much hand in hand with Rock's. We're not doing what we should be doing. Governments don't yet feel enough pressure in the streets, in the ballot box, to do something concrete. It's true. It's good for us to showcase technologies as an event, to build networks among scientists, among journalists, among entrepreneurs. But at the same time, there is the question if at this point with this COP in particular, and heading into a COP which will be in a petro state, there is a question if we are just being functional to governments and lobbying groups that are not doing enough by just showing up here, by being here. There is also we were just talking about this, there is a considerable amount of participants of COP that don't have a problem with this, that are up to the point we know okay with this situation or see things in a more positive way. But the truth is that we may be at this point it could be the case that we are being functional to maintaining COPs and a false sense of hope, which is particularly dangerous in the current situation, just by being here. There is the possibility perhaps of doing a shadow COP, of doing a COP that has other rules, that has an actual working venue that tries to minimize the carbon footprint even more, we have generated an enormous amount of trash. We've seen it through the pictures that Michael took.
Yeah.
And
we have over
there could be
refrigerated the
shadow.
conference halls. We've over refrigerated the conference
Yes.
halls. I mean, the people were saying it was 75 degrees, and they had the conferences cooled to like 65. They didn't even need any air conditioning, and they had them running full tilt. So this is pretty disturbing, you know. And
yes,
you know, we count on these
at the
conferences to put the message front and forward, and you know, to some extent that happens. But we also count on these conferences to actually codify agreements where the national parties, the participating nations, are bound to agreements. We haven't seen one signed. So you know, I'm very concerned. I'm kind of in the Greta Thunberg camp. She boycotted this year. She said it was just going to be a greenwashing exercise. So far, I think there's been a lot of information shared, and you know, nice people meeting nice people. But this is not the rate that we need to go to get this done. I know that Al Gore had an expression, and I'm not even sure that he's responsible for it, that everything goes really, really incrementally slowly until it starts to go really fast. So that was true of cell phone adoption, for instance. It kind of came out of nowhere and surprised everybody. The same thing with gay marriage in the U.S. It was kind of a non-issue for years, and then suddenly it took over. Now everybody's on board. So maybe we'll see some kind of a effect like that, but we haven't seen it so far.
Everyone seemed to be betting on exactly that. The problem is that it's a very dangerous bet. We could find ourselves in a situation where ecosystem services collapse right and left around us, and we're left in very dangerous food security situation.
We had a great discussion with a psychiatrist last night who said
Events.
when people get desperate, they kind of revert. They use the back lobe instead of the frontal lobe, and they become very like adolescents, and they become very petulant and very angry and short-tempered, and they start to point fingers at the other. So we're concerned as the level of catastrophe rate rises, and as strife, you know, the tensions wear thin, that people will start to there'll be more hostility. You know, I'm really worried about that. Rock, do you have any additional thoughts before we let Esteban get on that taxi? I know he's trying to get to the airport.
Well, speaking both as a student who was interested in history until I met John, Dr. Capece, I think that the old statement and phrase, you know, revolution is just 3 missed meals away. And that is especially true with regard to climate change. There will be, I think, a reckoning if we don't get on this bandwagon very soon. Although, as always, I am a big Lord of the Rings fan. I do always hold that hope in the face of immeasurable darkness is the one thing that we have to keep holding on to. I very much dislike it when so many students come up to me and they say, well, listen, you know, it's obvious that COP27 is a failure like everything before it. We should adopt a climate nihilism type of view. Let's just go out and have fun and, you know, screw the rest of the world. We're just going to have a good time. I very much dislike that sentiment because it's essentially giving up the fight before you have even a chance to enter the arena. So what? The people boxing in the arena are not here representing you. You got to get into the arena yourself if you want to make this happen, which is why at the end of our student broadcast today, we told everybody, if you don't see a climate protest in your area, it's your responsibility to go out and organize one, because no one is going to fight for you harder than you're going to fight for yourself. So you have to really get out there, join these climate protests, get your name out there, get your voice out there. Despite the fact that COP27 isn't going to take the ball, isn't going to be the ball game that sets at home, you got to be out there and fight for yourself first, because no one else is going to do it better than you can.
Yeah, that's great advice. And the lack of civil society this year has been really apparent. You know, and that put pressure in Madrid, in Glasgow. That, you know, when you have 100,000 people screaming in the streets, the delegates hear that. It's all over the press, and we really didn't have that this year. I mean, there were some really well-meaning protesters, but they were 20 to 50, maybe 100. So I think that was a real dearth this year. I don't know whether that's the reason no agreements were signed. You know, I know that the loss and damage thing has been gumming up the works. So, you know, maybe that's the logjam. I don't know. But Esteban, do you have any parting remarks? I know we need to get you into a cabin to the airport.
Regarding what you just said, perhaps the lack of protests has not been beneficial at all. I tend to agree. Again, given that this COP was actually done in a country where protests are definitely not easy to occur, where and in particular in a secluded location, not in a big city, in a pretty much secluded location with a lot of security presence. And given that the next one will be in a petrostate, perhaps we need to seriously consider doing a shadow COP with perhaps bilateral agreements among the countries that do mean to do something concrete. And there are countries actually exerting actual solutions and taking this more seriously. Perhaps we need to do a shadow COP with the parties and the NGOs and the civil society that actually means to take this seriously. And I agree pretty much with Rock. Apathy and nihilism at this point are our worst enemy. Even though we cannot say that things are going well, it would be equally dangerous. At the same time, we have no other choice but to be hopeful and to work every day for this.
Well, you guys are great examples of how young people are digging in and not succumbing to a sense of hopelessness. And I think that's really, really important. And we also learned that every person can have an effect. Every single person who steps into the arena and steps up to fight has an effect. So, it may be incremental. It may seem like we're not really getting there, but all of us have an obligation to step into that fight and keep getting the word out. So, thank you, Esteban. Have a safe trip home. And Rock, stick with us because we're going to get into a larger group in just a minute if we can solve a Wi-Fi problem. So thank you, Esteban, for all your reporting this week and your interest and passion. So we're doing things a little bit differently in this show, as you see. Instead of our usual routine of an interview and Michael's photos and other chats, we've basically invited our team for a little roundtable discussion about the conference and what worked and what didn't work. We had a few more members who are on their way. We had Capece, the Han Baykeeper, who left earlier this week, and we had Sheikh Fadel Wad, who was here and left a couple of days ago. We still have Douada Gueye, who's the Barney Coast, the executive director of Barney Coast Waterkeeper. We have John Capece, my co-host, Dr. John Capece, the Kissimmee Waterkeeper, with us, and Jeff Dismukes, who's been with us for the second half of the conference. And of course, we have Valholly Frank, who was here from the start and is still with us. So guys, I just want to ask, guys and gals, do we think this whole exercise was worthwhile? Do we think on balance that the COP, as we experienced it this week and last week, was worth all the time and money we spent to put it on and get here?
Well, I was impressed with a lot of the discussions that took place at COP, the various commitments from many nations, the United States stepping up finally with some concrete actions domestically, if not internationally. My only concern is that it's a little late. This is COP27. What we saw here the past couple of weeks, we should have seen at COP2, 25 years ago. So whereas, there is progress being made, it may be too little too late.
Yeah. I mean, I would take a little bit of issue with that because I don't think we made nearly enough progress at this conference. There were no concrete agreements signed between the parties. I know there's a 20-page protocol that they're tinkering on right now, and maybe they'll deliver it. So last year, the fossil fuel agreement was not actually signed until Sunday, 2 days after the conference ends. So maybe we'll still have something on, something concrete signed. Jeff, your thought. This is your first COP. What do you think about, as you view it? What's your impression?
Oh, well, today I sat through the final plenary session on Article 26, which is the carbon trading market. And one thing that struck me is that what the government parties are trying to do is come to an agreement, or come to several agreements with a lot of lawyer involvement. And so there is, fine detail argument over this paragraph and this section and how this sentence is worded. And the US spent 45 minutes describing how they thought it was too broad and things like that. So I'm not sure if us in civil society or even NGOs are expecting too much out of what could possibly come out of these government cooperations and actual textual agreements, because it is so technical, and that's part of international law, unfortunately. And so I was more impressed with a lot of the innovations I saw in the national pavilions, particularly Japan was displaying incredibly efficient, lightweight electric motors, and so I think that for that reason, COP is more valuable than for the reason that the convention is actually for agreement between the parties. And I'm not sure if any amount of protesting at these events is going to make it any quicker or any more resolute by the governments. Maybe the protests should be more focused at home so that we change things at the ballot box. I know we garner media attention from protests, and that's a good thing at these things. And I know this year, because there hasn't been these mass protests, we probably haven't seen a lot of media coverage around the world, which is bad. But I was really impressed with some of the technological solutions that are coming on board quicker than I expected them to be coming on board, and definitely a lot quicker than any agreement between the parties.
Yeah, I mean, that's my impression too, is that it was basically a glorified trade show. And there's a lot of value in a trade show, especially if, it brings people together and they kind of learn what their neighbor's doing they might not have known about. But last year, there were agreements signed on methane reduction, on deforestation, on fossil fuels, and there was the Glasgow Climate Pact signed, which had a whole bunch of other commitments and details. And this year, nada, nothing. So I think we fell far short. A lot of.
I think there's still hope that we'll get something signed. There's definitely a lot of frustration amongst the parties, and I felt that today. And I think it would be historic if they walked away from this event without any signed agreement. So I think there's a lot of impetus, hopefully in the next day or two, to actually come up with some signed agreements.
Last year they dragged the fossil fuel thing over the finish line 2 days after the conference, so maybe. Valholly, what are your thoughts? You've attended a couple of conferences, right? Did you go to Madrid?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think?
I was at Madrid.
Yeah.
I was at Madrid for COP15 and COP25, and I was here for COP17 and COP27. Honestly, there was a lot of youth and indigenous participation, and that was really cool to see. It was really great for connecting with people, both of those conferences. It was great for networking and learning what people around the world are doing. And I did learn a lot of amazing things. I was able to talk to doctors and politicians from all across the world, and that was really amazing and definitely inspiring considering the politicians we have at home. But
at home
overall,
in Southwest
yeah.
Florida. Yeah.
Yeah, or the United States in general. And we'll deal with that once we get back in the States. But honestly, I think the conference fell short of what it can be, as it will do and has done. People will ask me back home, they'll say, like, man, that sounds very important. Like, a lot must get done at those. And I was like, not enough. I mean, it is the 27th one. So, like John was saying, yeah, a little late, but I guess we have to take what we can. I'm not sure what else we can get from these. It's definitely hard to remain hopeful, but there are good things coming. But at the same time, a lot of this COP was spent talking about the failures of past ones and how certain pledges or agreements are either not coming through the way they should be, or countries are trying to like back out of their agreements. And I worry if anything does get done, it's just going to be news for another COP about how it's trying to be reversed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this was supposed to be the implementation COP, where all the pledges made in past years were put to the test of whether people in the climate action tracker, with this usually goes by the acronym CAT, does a very good job of assessing whether the countries who pledged one thing and are falling short are measuring up or not. And that this was supposed to be that, but we didn't even get that far. We didn't. I mean, I don't think we've really gotten out of the blocks with this one. And this was supposed to be the Africa COP. You know, it's taking place in Egypt. There was a lot of talk about African delegations being there in great numbers, and they were. I mean, I think the Congolese delegation was one of the biggest at COP, and there were other countries. I mean, we had 3 Senegalese waterkeepers there. Douada, we can do it in English or French. C'était censé être le COP de l'Afrique. Est-ce que tu es satisfait du résultat du progrès?
Malheureusement, non.
The African COP. Are you satisfied?
Malheureusement, non. Toute la société civile africaine a montré sa déception.
So all of African civil society has demonstrated their frustration and their lack of satisfaction.
On avait cru que c'était une COP de mise en œuvre, surtout pour les pertes et dommages. Mais malheureusement, on l'a remis à 2024. Et là, c'est une très grande déception. Pourquoi? Parce que l'article 6 a des résultats décourageants, en particulier sur le continent africain.
So let me translate that. So this was supposed to be, what gummed up the works was this issue of loss and damage. And this was a very, very important issue, not only for the African states, but a lot of the underdeveloped countries around the world. And that was not achieved. And it's widely believed that the reason no other agreements were signed was because nobody could conclude an agreement on loss and damage. And a lot of the countries, including 134 developing nations, all said, we need to have the loss and damage agreement signed before we sign on to other agreements. So, yeah, so Article 6, vas-y, Douada Gueye.
Là, on peut déjà conclure que la COP va se terminer, laissant des millions d'Africains dans la misère contenue liée au climat. Parce qu'actuellement, l'agriculture a régressé de 34%.
Et au Sénégal ou en général en Afrique?
En Afrique.
Okay,
puis,
so millions of people will suffer because of climate change in Africa. Douada is saying that agricultural success or the agricultural effects or net agriculture has been reduced by 30% across Africa because of climate change.
Et aussi, par exemple, pour les coûts de l'adaptation, les pays développés attendaient 127 milliards de dollars, alors que l'Afrique a besoin de 86,5 milliards. Si on prend le coût qui a été, disons, les 127 milliards de dollars, c'est extrêmement faible par rapport au coût d'adaptation. C'est-à-dire que les mêmes problèmes vont rester pendant qu'il y a, disons, les cyclones qui ont créé des millions de morts en Afrique du Sud, au Zimbabwe, et tout ça, ça dit que ça va continuer. Ça dit qu'on n'a pas donné les moyens nécessaires pour que l'on puisse faire une adaptation et surtout les
so the adaptation, which is to prepare for the worst impacts of climate change, adaptation, so that the population is protected and there are measures taken to shore up society, falls far short. And the African countries in Senegal, Douada's home country, were counting on some of that money to offset the harm that they've experienced already, and it's only going to get worse. So, yeah, and then that goes straight into the question of loss and damage. So I'm sure everybody knows loss and damage is the concept whereby the developed countries should underwrite the losses of underdeveloped countries who were not responsible for fossil fuel, greenhouse gases. But they're still suffering enormous harm. So we're trying to get the developed nations who are much more wealthy to pay reparations for the countries who have not caused the climate crisis and are nonetheless suffering, in many cases, suffering more harm than the rest of the world. So, and this has proved to be the issue that cannot be resolved. And Douada is saying it's being kicked off to 2024. I think there's still some attempt to try to get it written at the end of this conference, but I don't know. Any thoughts about that, John? About loss and damage? I know you were
loss and damage.
Yeah.
It just seems like a fairly simple issue to deal with. I mean, the United States is spending easily, 50, probably better part of $100 billion a year on this issue. 1% is $1 billion. Even if it's just $50 billion, 2%. And the discussion seems to be 100 million, 150 million. These are all very small amounts relative to what the United States is spending. So it's clearly not the absolute amount that is concerning to the United States and the developing nations. I think it's more the precedent. So I think the solution is to just set a percentage and to make sure that whatever percentage is assigned to loss and damage, that loss and damage is also allocated with some attention paid to efforts on the part of these developing nations to divert away from developing their own fossil fuels or developing their economies based upon fossil fuels. So that seems like a fairly straightforward issue to deal with. What's more concerning is that the United States isn't spending enough. $100 billion isn't even nearly enough. That's 10%. It ought to be $1 billion, $1 trillion, $2 trillion a year. If we were spending like on World War II, it'd be $7 trillion a year. So the problem is not the loss and damage. The problem is, unless we deal with the primary issue, some people may die before others, but we're all going to die of this crisis. So we have to first make sure that not everybody on the planet is going to die, to succumb from this catastrophe. And once momentum is set there, the loss and damage should just go along for the ride as a certain percentage of what all the nations are spending on mitigation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There should be some kind of carrot and stick so that you give grants to countries, but only on condition that they develop their green energies and they start to cut back on their fossil fuel, because the last thing we want to do is give them money they can then use to enhance, to grow or enhance their fossil fuels. I wanted to talk to you about, John, about the war in Ukraine and how that's putting strain on food scarcity, on fuel, because a lot of people had to scramble. I mean, Russia was such an enormous provider of basically of oil and gas, provided a lot of Europe's gas. Germany was using 50% of their gas intake came from Russia. So when those tariffs went into effect and those sanctions, a lot of countries, a lot of European countries and other countries around the world had to scramble for alternative sources of fuel. and their green energies hadn't come online yet, and we basically turned off the spigot, and that caused them in some cases to go to Africa and actually grow some of those fossil fuel industries in African countries where they need the money, but where we're trying to have them tap off their fossil fuel production rather than ramp it up. Any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, it's clearly an issue, and it's not only an issue relative to Europeans looking to Africa and other nations, the United States. I mean, right here in Florida, we're dealing with a case right now on a natural gas pipeline to supply for a liquefied natural gas export facility. So it's putting pressure even in the United States to build infrastructure. And once that infrastructure is in place, you know, people expect to get a return on investment for years, if not decades. And we don't need more what should be stranded assets developed in the United States or any nation. And then, you know, it's not just oil and gas relative to the food, it's the actual food production out of Russia and their production of fertilizers, because fertilizers are very energy intensive process, particularly nitrogen fertilizers, and a fossil fuel rich nation often exports those fossil fuels in the form of fertilizers as a product based upon the use of the fossil fuels. So that's having an impact globally as well.
Yeah,
so we need to get away from these fossil fuel energies, and the United States is somewhat taking advantage of it. You know, we heard the announcement of 3 small modular reactors being slated for deployment in Ukraine, specifically to generate hydrogen and fertilizer production. And whereas small modular reactors are something we need to develop and test, the type of modular reactor they're going to deploy is still a light water reactor rather than some of the generation 4, like the pebble bed reactors and other things that are still a little further down the road in development.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's an argument to be made that in the absence of agreements coming out of the COP, other people kind of raise themselves by their own bootstraps and try to get it done in other ways. And I know during the Trump administration, cities and states were taking on, you know, an environmental and climate change and, you know, trending toward green economies, regardless of what the federal government was doing. So, and we're seeing that a little bit, and we're seeing technology being developed. We're seeing, I mean, we'll lead the private sector. You know, they maybe they'll come to the fore and you know, help us out of this mess. I know the R&D budget, you know, we've talked about that, is not nearly what it should be. I see you shaking your head. You don't think that the private sector's ready to climb into those boots, huh?
The private sector is ready to sell stuff, but they want to sell what they've got now. You know, whether or not it's ready for prime time, whether or not it's been developed to be sufficiently, you know, carbon neutral. It's technology in its intermediate phase. The, you know, government needs to drive forward the research and development and get a few more iteration cycles on some of these technologies before we scale them up. Otherwise, we're scaling up technologies that may address 10% of the problem, whereas now we need to scale up things that address 50% of the problem or better. And you know, I don't go to the plenary sessions at these COPs because I just do not think that's where the solutions are going to come from. The governments, basically, particularly in democracies, they follow the economy. You know, they are basically support mechanisms for a capitalistic economy. They do not drive the economy. They do not steer the economy. They just kind of try to hold on tight and ride it along. So what they need to do is drive the research and development, get some really revolutionary products and services out there that can drive down the costs dramatically of renewable energies. And then the private sector will scale that up. But the private sector wants to scale up and profit from whatever technologies are at hand right now. And right now, we could get it done with this, but the economics aren't there. We just have to drive down the cost of renewable energies into the dirt and make it a simple decision for everybody around the world.
Yeah, we saw that in Israel, where the cost of desalination is now cheaper than other traditional forms of electricity, or other forms of water treatment. And we saw it a little bit. Well, you saw it with solar panels. The cost of solar panels has plummeted, while the adoption rate.
But two factors.
Yeah,
there's two factors there. There's the technology that drives down the cost, and then there's the economies of scale and the production methodologies. So the private sector getting experience in producing and selling and deploying technologies does help drive down the cost, but it's got to be coupled with really innovative technologies at the same time.
Yeah. So I got a question for you, John. What do you think? What do you think the effect of the lack of protest or civil society at this COP was? Do you think that had any tangible effect on the discussions, on the press, on just the tone of the conference in general?
Well, there's definitely an excitement and an energy that comes from the protests, and I imagine that has an effect not only on us observers attending, but also on the delegations. I mean, when Greta would show up at a COP, it's like, Elvis is in the house. Everything converges on her, everything. And nothing else might as well be going on in the conference when she walks in the door. So it does generate energy, and that cannot be lost upon the delegates when they see, presidents being put on the back burner when Greta shows up. That tells them that there's potential for a dynamic movement among the population, and that's really what we have to generate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that last year in Glasgow, when there were 20,000 people for that first Friday, 100,000 people the next day, I am sure the delegates felt that pressure. Those brilliant, brave barbarians were at the gates, and there was probably concern they were going to storm any day. I mean, they were peaceful, but that created a kind of crucible and created pressure, and it got an enormous amount of press. And I just think that this was ill-conceived to put the conference at such a remote location, a luxury destination on the Sinai, where it's so expensive to get there, it's so expensive to be housed. And then the authorities in Egypt were basically tamping down any kind of protest. They weren't even allowing people without badges to enter the city. So I think that had a net effect, and I'm worried about next year at the United Arab Emirates for the same reason.
Well, Jeff touched on a very important point. Whereas the protests may be interesting and dynamic here and invigorating, where they really matter is back home in the various nations. Put pressures on the governments, because the governments simply come to these conferences with certain opening positions and bottom lines in mind. They have their marching orders on negotiation and how far they can go. So you have to change how far these representatives can go based upon domestic politics and pressure. So the protests really have to be stressed at home.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Earlier we had Esteban and Rock on, and they were saying the very same thing. If you're not already out in the streets protesting, get out there. We need everybody out in the streets, voicing their concerns, knocking on doors, calling their elected officials. We need to apply a lot more pressure.
Another thing we need is exit polling. There was an article, and I'll write something up on this, that emphasized how from 2020 to 2022, double the number of people walking out of the polling stations said that their top issue was climate. And that was only 8%, but it was double from 4% in 2020.
Right, and it's probably 10 times that if you talk to people between 18 and 29. The young people, it's a real grave concern for young people. We're going to see them ripple through society. Hopefully the next election will have more people like Valholly stepping up. Well, Valholly's now voting age, but when she started, she was 12. And then we interviewed a young lady, Daru, the Waterkeeper in Indonesia. Her daughter's 15, and she's been doing climate change activism since she was 10. So those kids are going to step up. They're going to fill the ranks, and I just hope we're not too far gone by the time we pass the torch to them. John, I want to ask you about U.S. leadership. And I think that there was a lot to be said for U.S. leadership. And to some extent, they stepped into the void because China pulled back. India wasn't there. Russians were clearly not there. So, you know, Biden could really occupy the space. But what do you think? Are you satisfied with the level of leadership you saw out of the United States these 2 weeks?
Well, I'm pleased to see it increasing dramatically, but I'm in no way satisfied with what I saw. For example, you know, I in my commentary in yesterday's broadcast, I talked about the net zero government session and how the U.S. was touting, you know, net zero government by 2050 and reduction by 50% by 2030. And every country participating in this initiative with the United States needed to come to COP28 with a plan. And then the Japanese representative basically said, we had a plan in 2002. You know, where have you been?
Yeah. So, folks, we're broadcasting this from Egypt, and we had a router issue. So the owner of the apartment we're in brought another router, but it was not strong enough. So we lost Valholly and we lost Douada and we lost Jeff for a minute. It looks like Valholly's back. We are talking about whether civil society, the attendant civil society this week had enough of an impact. And then we talked about whether we felt that there was sufficient U.S. leadership at the conference week 1 and week 2. You guys have anything you want to chime in about U.S. leadership, what you saw, whether you're satisfied, dissatisfied?
From Joe Biden's speech, it was it felt watered down. It felt annoying to hear the classic, like, oh yeah, this matters, this is important, or taking big steps. And honestly, the funniest part to me was when a bunch of natives from the crowd started yelling and they held up a sign, and like the confusion on Joe Biden's face, just looking out, reading that sign, and then just like, anyway. And it was just kind of a funny representation of how it goes. And as for civil society and participation with this, all of the protests were cool to see after like quite a bit of silence. There were quite a few days where there was just nothing happening protest-wise. And although all of them were small, it was still something. Very few of them had like a big message going on, but again, it was something. But I think the protests everyone saw the most were the vegan protests out front, right outside of registration. And those were always fun. They always had people in costumes where they were singing and dancing. So pretty representative of how I think everyone views climate activists, or especially like vegan activists. There's a big part of the world that just sees them as like these crazy hippies. And it is hard to disagree when you see that type of singing and dancing outside of the conference of the parties, where everyone is very professional. And U.S. leadership, they had a lot of great presentations at the pavilion, and that was cool to see, especially when you attend Al Gore's talks about climate trace and you see all of the NASA presentations at the U.S. Center and the use of AI and satellites, and you can sort of compare and contrast the technologies being used and how they're being used. So really informative, but I honestly saw the most U.S. leadership out of Kathy Castor, but that was just because she was the one bold enough to say that these issues are happening now, and she was bold enough to talk about reparations and talk about the history of the U.S. and how it's important to take that into account when creating new laws. And that was cool to see, but it
So just so everybody knows,
also could just be the classic Democrat thing of keeping the system the way the system is working now, making sure everything is kept the same. But
little transmission problem, but well, I agree, Valholly. I mean, I think we need to be happy warriors in this fight. I think we cannot succumb to despair. We can't afford to just, you know, toss in the towel. We have to stay in the fight. So in general, are you more or less hopeful at the end of this COP than you were going in? Valholly.
I think it's probably about the same, especially because there are a lot of things happening in the States right now that have been hard to hear about and keep up with. It's hard to stay hopeful. I do what I can to not completely succumb to nihilistic views. But I'm definitely, like, the fact that I'm here and the fact that I'm still giving my attention to this is, I think, proof that I haven't given up all hope. But it's hard, and I think that pessimism is necessary, especially when there are events like COI happening where everything is all self-congratulatory and just way too celebratory and not serious enough for as big of an issue this is.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah. You guys are sharing a headset,
So
sharing a microphone.
I just, yeah, yeah, exactly. Trying to limit our bandwidth consumption. I just want to say, I think the most depressing thing that happened at COP27 was the world population surpassing 8 billion people. And, you know, there's really not a whole lot of discussion on what we're doing about that. And that is probably the major issue. And so I came away fairly depressed by that, and depressed by the fact that essentially everything that we're discussing here doesn't really do anything about the population issues. And as far as U.S. leadership, I just want to say, I don't know if you saw the news that the EU did a reversal to try to free up agreement on loss and damage by agreeing that there could at least be a separate fund established for that. The U.S. unfortunately did not backtrack, and the U.S. is still trying to say it can be handled through the World Bank and all other institutions, and that there doesn't need to be a separate fund. So I was encouraged by the EU and disappointed that the US didn't go along with that.
Yeah. Douada, est-ce que tu as plus d'espoir ou moins d'espoir à la fin de ce COP? You have more or less hope at the end of this COP?
Moins d'espoir.
Hein? Pardon?
J'ai moins d'espoir dans le fait que l'Afrique... Je disais moins d'espoir dans le fait que l'Afrique va encore recevoir les plus importants effets des changements climatiques sans...
Yep, might have lost Douada. Yeah, we're having some network issues.
Essaye.
Wait.
Ouais, non, vous m'entendez? You hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
J'ai dit que l'Afrique, vraiment, il y a une déception parce qu'on aurait pensé vraiment à ce que l'on... J'ai dit l'Afrique aurait vraiment, c'est une vraie déception personnellement, même si c'est ma première COP. On a constaté quand même qu'il n'y a pas eu trop d'avancées par rapport aux espoirs. Ouais. Et aujourd'hui, si on va penser maintenant qu'on va remettre les pertes en dommages en 2024, cela veut dire que même le financement de la dotation n'est pas assez suffisant. Et là, ça donnera encore, disons, une voie aux pays africains à continuer à consommer les énergies fossiles. Parce que le problème, c'est qu'actuellement, on sait très bien que si, par exemple, les pays riches ne peuvent pas mettre ce qu'il faut, ils ne prennent pas la responsabilité des pertes et dommages. Parce que le problème, c'est une question de responsabilité. Et même si, par exemple, le président John Kerry annonce sur le marché du crédit carbone sans qu'on ait assez d'éléments pour les évaluer. Le problème actuellement, c'est un problème d'évaluation.
So Douada is saying that
malheureusement
he's
aussi,
extremely
ils
disappointed.
ont tendance à tendre la main,
Yeah,
à
one
demander
second,
toujours de
Douada.
l'argent.
I have to translate that. So Douada is extremely disappointed, and most of his compatriots throughout Africa are extremely disappointed with this COP, and it comes back to the loss and damage, and they're concerned and fearful of what the next 4 years will bring. If it takes 4 years to achieve some kind of resolution on loss and damage, there's going to be an enormous amount of human suffering in that time. So he's generally extremely disappointed. So let's the summation. Any parting thoughts? I mean, I think we have to redouble our efforts. I think we can't be in despair. We have to charge forward. We have to be more active than ever. Try to bring this message to whatever public we have. Get out in the streets, contact our officials, make sure that it stays a #1 priority. John, any parting thoughts before we adjourn?
One of the things at this COP that I found compared to previous COPs is that the crowd seems to be getting younger. We're getting older. And if you go back, 5, 10 years, these conferences would have been dominated by gray hairs. But now it's a distinct and dwindling minority. The people coming to these events and engaging the events are extremely young. The governments are sending younger representatives and putting them in positions of authority. Let's just hope they can generate the dynamics within their nations.
Can't happen soon enough. So, John, thank you for all your contributions all week of the last 13 days. Jeff, really nice to have your input for this last week at the conference. Valholly, it is a delight to hear from you. Every time we hear from you, it's really a pleasure, refreshing, and you've been at this for a long time now. And Douada, je te remercie pour tes contributions et je te souhaite bon courage pour la lutte en Afrique. We just wanted to kind of do a little recap.
Merci beaucoup.
Get everybody's thoughts, and we will see everybody next year in the United Arab Emirates. Thank you. We've had wonderful guest interviews all week, including 9 members of the Waterkeeper Alliance and many other brilliant guests. We want to thank them for their enormous contributions to the effort. I also want to thank our team on the ground, Dr. John Capece, tech guru and photographer Michal Fidler, along with Valholly Frank, Esteban Rodofili, Jeff Dismukes, and Aboujouade. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors who helped underwrite these programs, the Metzger family, True Elements, and our press sponsor, Florida Weekly. Before we go, I just want to read something Al Gore once said. As human beings, we're vulnerable to confusing the unprecedented with the improbable. In our everyday experience, if something has never happened before, we're generally safe in assuming it is not going to happen in the future. But the exceptions can kill you. And climate change is one of those exceptions. Thank you. Keep up the fight. See you next year for COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. Good night.